Romans chapter 3, verse 19 says, now we know that whatever the law says, and that's the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, it says to those who are under the law that every mouth may be stopped and that all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh is justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So it's basically the law came, what is the law? The law is broken up into three parts. There's the civil law, which is, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's how we interact, right? Civilly, civil laws. A murderer deserves capital punishment, murder. That's what the law said. The hygienic law, wash your hands, clean your food, don't eat these certain kinds of meats. It's the hygienic law. And then there's shadow Christology, which is the shadows of Christ. So they were told to do certain sacrificial systems through the years, right? So one of them we know well, which is Passover. They take a very young sheep, right, and they sacrifice it. And so, but it's a representation of Jesus. It's blameless. It's young. It doesn't fight for its life. Jesus didn't fight for his life. And we see that they, year after year, went through this shadow Christology, which was teaching them that blood was required and a sacrifice was required for their sins to be forgiven, right? And so what that did was that caused them to stay in a state of sin consciousness because they knew they were never good enough. They would have to do another sacrifice. In other words, they had to keep appeasing God through the sacrificial system, but all it was doing was it was pointing to Jesus. It was pointing to Christ. And so as they went through that system, it was accounted them for righteousness that year, right? And then they got through it. So what the Bible is saying here as we read these first two verses, we know it says that the law spoke to those at that time that every mouth would be stopped, that everyone that didn't do the sacrificial system was lost. There was no way to even be accounted righteousness without believing that there was a coming Messiah and that you were a sinner, right? It says that, and all the world may become guilty. Well, everyone's guilty because now they know the laws of God. And if they don't know them, or if they don't obey them, they're now guilty, right? And then verse 20 says, by the deeds of the law. In other words, if you kept the law, it didn't justify. And justification means that if we have a court case where there's charges against us, right? Right now we're indicted, we're charged. And so justification means that the judge has stamped that file justified, meaning that all charges are cleared from us, okay? So it says that, verse 20 again, says, therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, capital S, that's God's. For the law is the knowledge of sin. It really brings us a knowledge of sin. But now, right now, Romans, Holy Spirit, after the death, burial, and resurrection, but now, the righteousness of God. It's God's righteousness. Apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there's no difference. So righteousness and unrighteousness, righteousness means right standing in the eyes of God. So if we stand before God, God sees us as righteous so he can have a relationship with us. And so righteousness, it means that we have gone from unrighteousness where we were lost, we were sinners, even when it was accounted to us for righteousness in the Old Testament. If you took Abraham, wasn't righteous. He was unrighteous, but righteousness was accounted to him because his sins weren't taken care of in the eyes of God. That's why all Old Testament saints, when they died, they didn't go to heaven. They went into a place called paradise, we find in Luke chapter 16, and they waited there until Jesus resurrected and ascended, and then he brought their spirits and souls of David, Nehemiah, Isaiah, all of the saints in the Old Testament, because they were still unrighteous. Their sins weren't paid for, and so they resurrected up into heaven. So when we look at what he's saying here, the righteousness of God that we get by faith, that means that God created an agreement called covenant that we're going to look at today, where our faith was the only requirement to join the agreement.